The wind howled like a wild animal outside Betty's small house. Snow fell so thick that she couldn't see past her front porch. At 78 years old, Betty had seen many storms in her life, but this one felt different. The weatherman on TV said it would be the worst blizzard in 20 years. Betty sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the snow pile up against her fence. Her little house stood alone on the edge of town, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed dangerously in the wind. She had moved here 40 years ago with her late husband, and even though people told her it was too far from everything, she loved the peace and quiet. The power had been flickering on and off all day. Betty had prepared well, though. She had candles, extra blankets, and enough soup to last a week. Her wood stove crackled warmly in the corner, filling the room with a cozy orange glow. She pulled her knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders and sipped her hot tea. Around 6 in the evening, Betty heard something strange over the howling wind. It sounded like engines, but not car engines. These were deeper, rougher, motorcycles. But who would be crazy enough to ride motorcycles in weather like this? The sound got louder and closer. Betty peered through her frost-covered window and saw headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Not just one or two lights, but many. The engines roared and sputtered as they came up her long driveway. Betty felt her heart beat faster. She lived alone and rarely had visitors, especially not the kind who rode motorcycles. She had heard stories about motorcycle gangs on the news. Were they dangerous? Should she call the police? But then she remembered her phone lines were down from the storm. The engines stopped one by one, and Betty heard voices outside, deep, rough voices of men talking to each other. She couldn't make out what they were saying over the wind, but she could tell there were quite a few of them. Then came a knock on her door. Not a harsh pounding, but a gentle, respectful knock. Betty stood up slowly, her old joints creaking. She walked to the door but didn't open it right away. "Ma'am?" called a voice from outside. "We're really sorry to bother you. We got caught in this storm and our bikes are having trouble. We saw your light and wondered if we could use your phone or maybe wait out the worst of this weather." Betty looked through the small window next to her door. In the porch light, she could see a group of men in leather jackets covered with snow. They were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands together, clearly freezing. Some had long beards white with ice, and their faces looked red from the cold wind. One man stepped forward. He was tall and broad, with kind eyes that reminded Betty of her own son. He took off his knit cap respectfully when he saw her looking. "Ma'am, I know this looks scary," he said loud enough for her to hear through the door. "We're part of a motorcycle club, and we were heading home from a charity ride when this storm hit us out of nowhere. We've got some older guys with us who really need to get warm. We won't cause any trouble, I promise." Betty thought for a moment. These men could easily break down her door if they wanted to, but they were asking politely. And they did look absolutely miserable in the cold. Her motherly instincts kicked in, the same ones that had led her to feed every stray cat and help every neighbor in need for decades. She unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The cold air rushed in immediately and she could see her breath. "How many of you are there?" she asked. 15, ma'am. I know that's a lot, but we'll stay outside if you prefer. We just hoped maybe we could use your phone." Betty looked at the group again. She could see some of them were older, probably in their 60s. One man was leaning heavily on his motorcycle, clearly struggling with the cold. Despite their tough appearance with all the leather and patches, they looked like a group of dads and granddads who just happened to love motorcycles. "The phone lines are down," Betty said, "but you can't stay outside in this weather. You'll freeze to death." She opened the door wider. "Come in, all of you, but wipe your feet." The relief on their faces was immediate. One by one, they filed into Betty's small living room, removing their boots and jackets. They moved carefully, trying not to drip snow everywhere or knock anything over with their large frames. "Ma'am, this is incredibly kind of you," said the first man who had spoken. "I'm Tom, and this is my riding group. We can't thank you enough." Betty looked around her living room, now packed with 15 large men who seemed to fill every corner of the space. Some sat on her couch, others on the floor. They all looked grateful, but also worried about imposing on this small elderly woman. "Well, you're here now," Betty said practically. "Are any of you hurt?" A few of them had cuts on their hands from trying to fix their bikes in the storm, and one older gentleman named Frank was shivering uncontrollably. Betty immediately went into grandmother mode. "Frank, you sit right here by the fire," she commanded, pointing to the chair closest to her wood stove. "Tom, help me get some towels so everyone can dry off. And someone needs to help me move the coffee table so we have more room." The men jumped to help, grateful to have something useful to do. They followed Betty's instructions like well-behaved children. Despite their intimidating appearance, they said yes, ma'am, and thank you to everything. Betty bustled around her kitchen, pulling out every pot and pan she owned. "I hope you all like vegetable soup," she called out. "It's about all I have that will feed this many people." "Ma'am, you don't need to feed us," Tom protested. "You've already done more than enough." "Nonsense," Betty replied firmly. "You're guests in my house during a storm. Of course I'm going to feed you." As the soup heated up, the men began to relax. They told Betty about their motorcycle club, which wasn't a gang at all, but a group of friends who rode together and raised money for children's charities. They had been returning from a toy drive when the storm caught them. Betty learned that Tom was a retired teacher, Frank was a grandfather of 6, and another man named Joe was a volunteer firefighter. They came from all walks of life but shared a love of motorcycles and helping others. The storm raged on outside, shaking the windows and piling snow higher and higher. But inside Betty's little house, something wonderful was happening. A group of strangers had become temporary family, brought together by kindness and a shared need for shelter from the storm. As the soup simmered on the stove, Betty's small house filled with the most wonderful smell. The 15 men sat wherever they could find space, looking much more comfortable now that they were warm and dry. Their leather jackets hung on every chair and doorknob, dripping the last of the melted snow onto towels Betty had spread on the floor. "This smells like my grandmother's cooking," said Frank, the older gentleman who had been shivering so badly. His color was finally returning to normal as he sat close to the wood stove. Betty smiled as she stirred the big pot. "It's nothing fancy, just carrots, potatoes, and whatever vegetables I had left. But it'll warm you up from the inside out." Tom stood up to help her carry bowls, but Betty waved him back down. "You just rest. I've been cooking for people my whole life. I raised 4 children and fed half the neighborhood kids too. This is nothing new for me." The men looked around at Betty's cozy home while they waited. The walls were covered with family photos, showing decades of Christmas mornings, graduations, and family gatherings. There were pictures of Betty as a young mother, then grandmother and great-grandmother. Hand-knitted blankets were draped over every piece of furniture. "You have a beautiful family," said Joe, the volunteer firefighter, looking at a photo of Betty surrounded by children and grandchildren. "Thank you," Betty said, bringing out the first bowls of soup, "though they're all scattered across the country now. My youngest granddaughter just started college in California. They worry about me living out here alone, but this old house has good bones and I'm not ready to give up my independence yet." As Betty served the soup, something magical began to happen. The men started sharing stories about their own families. Tom talked about his students and how teaching had changed over the years. Frank showed pictures of his grandchildren from his wallet. Another man named Dave shared how he had started riding motorcycles after his wife died, and how the group had become like a second family to him. "We probably look pretty scary to most people," Dave admitted, spooning up Betty's soup. "But honestly, we're just a bunch of guys who like the freedom of the open road, and we try to do good things with our rides. Tell me about this charity ride you were on," Betty said, settling into her chair with her own bowl of soup. Tom's face lit up. "Every year before Christmas, we collect toys for kids whose families are struggling. We ride to different towns and people donate toys, money, whatever they can. This year we collected over 3,000 toys." 3,000, Betty exclaimed. "That's wonderful. Where were you taking them?" "To the children's hospital about 50 miles from here," Frank said. "But they're all loaded on our bikes outside, probably buried under snow by now." Betty looked concerned. "Those toys need to get to those children before Christmas. That's only a week away." "We know," Tom sighed. "We'll figure something out once this storm passes. The kids are counting on us." Outside, the wind continued to howl and the snow kept falling. Every now and then, one of the men would look toward the window with worry. Their motorcycles weren't meant for weather like this, and some of the older bikes had already been having trouble before they reached Betty's house. "How long have you all been riding together?" Betty asked, genuinely curious about these unexpected guests. "Most of us have known each other for about 10 years, said a quiet man named Ray. "We met at different bike rallies and charity events. When you're out on the road, you look out for each other. It becomes like a brotherhood. And we all have day jobs," added another man named Pete. "I'm an electrician, Tom teaches high school, Joe fights fires, And Frank here used to run a small business. We're just regular guys who happen to love motorcycles. Betty nodded thoughtfully. You know, people are so quick to judge by appearances. When I saw 15 men in leather jackets at my door, I'll admit I was nervous for a moment. But you're some of the most polite house guests I've ever had. The men chuckled at this. Our mothers raised us right, Tom said. Besides, any woman brave enough to open her door to 15 strangers in a snowstorm deserves nothing but respect. As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed easily. Betty told stories about the old days when the town was smaller, and everyone knew everyone else. She talked about her late husband, who had been a mechanic and would have loved talking motorcycles with the group. He would have had you all out in the garage looking at engines. Storm or no storm, Betty laughed. He could fix anything with wheels. The men shared their own stories of mechanical adventures and mishaps on the road. They talked about the most beautiful places they had ridden, the kindest people they had met, and the funniest things that had happened during their travels. Around 10 o'clock, the power went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness except for the flickering light from the wood stove. Betty moved around confidently in the dark, lighting candles she had strategically placed throughout the house. This happens every time we get a big storm, she said calmly. The power lines can't handle the weight of the snow, but we'll be fine with the wood stove and candles. The candlelight made the gathering feel even more intimate and special. The men's faces looked softer in the warm glow, and their stories became more personal. Dave talked about losing his wife to cancer and how riding helped him cope with grief. Frank shared memories of teaching his grandson to ride a bicycle. Joe told them about the scary fires he had fought and the families he had helped save. Betty listened to each story with the attention and care of a loving grandmother. She asked questions, offered comfort when needed, and shared her own experiences of loss and joy. You know, Betty said thoughtfully as she watched the snow continue to fall outside. This might be the best Christmas week I've had in years. My family couldn't make it home this year because of work and travel costs. I was planning to spend Christmas alone for the first time since my husband died. The room grew quiet. These tough-looking men felt their hearts break a little for this kind woman who had opened her home to them. Well, you're not alone now, Tom said firmly, and if this storm keeps up, it looks like we might be celebrating Christmas together. I'd like that, Betty said with a smile. Though I'm not sure I have enough ingredients to cook Christmas dinner for 16 people. Don't you worry about that, Frank said. Once this storm clears and we can get to town, we'll make sure you have the best Christmas dinner this house has ever seen. As midnight approached, the men started settling in for the night. Betty brought out every blanket and pillow she owned. Some men took the couch and chairs. Others made beds on the floor. No one complained about the accommodations. After being caught in that terrible storm, Betty's warm house felt like a 5-star hotel. Before everyone went to sleep, Tom stood up to address the group and their hostess. Betty, I want you to know that what you did tonight was extraordinary. You didn't just give us shelter from the storm. You reminded us what real kindness looks like. We won't forget this. Betty waved off the praise, but her eyes were bright with happiness. You boys get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll see what this storm has left us to deal with. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside Betty's house, 15 strangers had become friends, and one lonely woman had found an unexpected family for Christmas. Betty woke up to an unusual sound. Instead of the howling wind that had kept her half awake all night, she heard quiet voices and the gentle clinking of dishes. For a moment she forgot about her unexpected guests and wondered who could be in her kitchen. Then she remembered 15 motorcycle riders were sleeping in her living room. Betty smiled as she put on her robe and slippers. She had slept better than she had in months, feeling safer with all those protective men in her house than she had felt alone in years. When she walked into the kitchen, she found Tom and Joe quietly making coffee and cleaning up from the night before. They had folded all the blankets neatly and were trying to tidy up without waking anyone. Good morning, Betty whispered. You boys didn't have to clean up. Morning, Betty, Tom said softly. We wanted to help. You did so much for us last night. Joe poured her a cup of coffee. We've been up for about an hour. The storm finally stopped around 5 this morning. It's beautiful outside, but there's a lot of snow. Betty looked out her kitchen window and gasped. The world had been transformed into a winter wonderland. Snow covered everything in perfect white drifts that sparkled in the morning sun. But what really surprised her was how much snow had fallen. It reached halfway up her fence posts. "Oh my," she said. "I've never seen this much snow before." The other men started waking up one by one. Frank stretched his back and groaned good-naturedly about sleeping on the floor. Dave rubbed his neck and laughed about being too old for camping out. But despite the minor aches and pains, everyone seemed in good spirits. "How do the bikes look?" Pete asked as he joined them at the window. Tom's expression grew serious. "That's what we need to figure out. They're completely buried. We can see some handlebars sticking up, but that's about it." The men bundled up in their leather jackets and went outside to assess the situation. Betty watched from her window as they dug through the snow to reach their motorcycles. Even from inside, she could see the concern on their faces. After about an hour, they came back inside, stomping snow off their boots and shaking their heads. "It's not good," Frank said honestly. "Even if we could dig them all out, there's no way we're riding anywhere today. The roads haven't been plowed, and some of our bikes took on water from the blowing snow. Plus," added Ray, "we'd need to check all the engines before we could even think about starting them. Some of the older bikes are pretty temperamental in the best of weather." Betty could see the worry in their eyes. These men had jobs to get back to, families expecting them home, and most importantly, toys that needed to reach sick children before Christmas. "Well then," Betty said practically, "we'll just have to make the best of it. I'll make a big breakfast and we can figure out what to do from there." As Betty started pulling ingredients from her pantry, the men insisted on helping. Soon her small kitchen was bustling with activity. Tom proved to be surprisingly good at making pancakes. Joe scrambled eggs like a professional cook. Frank, despite his age, was an expert at frying bacon without burning it. "Where did you all learn to cook?" Betty asked, delighted by the help. "When you're on the road as much as we are, you learn to fend for yourself," Dave explained. "Plus, most of us are divorced or widowed. We had to figure out how to feed ourselves. And," added Pete with a grin, "Tom here used to run a breakfast diner before he became a teacher. He's been holding out on us." The breakfast was the largest meal Betty's kitchen had ever produced. Pancakes stacked high, platters of eggs and bacon, and fresh coffee that filled the house with its wonderful aroma. The men ate like they hadn't seen food in days, praising every bite. After breakfast, Tom made an important announcement. "I've been thinking about those toys in our bike storage compartments. We can't let those kids down. Even if we can't ride out of here today, maybe we can find another way to get the toys to the hospital. The nearest neighbor with a truck is about 2 miles away," Betty said thoughtfully. "But I don't know if anyone could make it through this snow." "What about calling for help?" suggested Joe. "Phone lines are still down," Frank reminded him, "and our cell phones aren't getting any signal out here." The group sat in Betty's living room, brainstorming solutions. These were problem-solving men who were used to fixing things, but this situation seemed impossible. Then Betty had an idea. "What about my neighbor, Robert? He lives about a mile down the road. He has one of those big snow machines. What do you call them?" "A snowmobile?" Tom asked hopefully. "That's it. He uses it to check on his cattle in weather like this. If someone could get to his place, maybe he could help us figure out how to transport the toys." The men looked at each other. Walking a mile through deep snow would be challenging, but it was possible. "I'll go," volunteered Joe. "I'm in pretty good shape, and I've done winter rescue training with the fire department." "I'll go with you," said Dave. 2 people are safer than one in these conditions." While Joe and Dave prepared for their trek through the snow, the other men worked on digging out the toys from their buried motorcycles. It was hard work, but they were determined. Box after box of toys emerged from the snow-covered bikes. Dolls, action figures, board games, puzzles, and stuffed animals, all carefully wrapped and labeled for different age groups. Betty watched from her window as the men formed an assembly line, passing toys from the buried bikes to her front porch. Despite the cold and difficult conditions, they worked with smiles on their faces, joking and encouraging each other. "These men really care about those children," Betty thought to herself. "They're willing to work this hard in freezing cold just to make sure some kids have Christmas presents." Around noon, Joe and Dave returned with exciting news. They had found Robert, and he was more than willing to help. Even better, he had called his brother, who owned a 4-wheel drive truck with a snowplow attachment. "Robert's brother can clear a path from here to the main road," Joe announced breathlessly. "And Robert knows the hospital administrator. He's going to call ahead and let them know the toys are coming." "When can they get here?" Tom asked eagerly. "They're loading up Robert's truck now," Dave said. "They should be here within a couple hours." The mood in the house immediately brightened. The men continued organizing toys while Betty started preparing another big meal. She was amazed by how much food 15 hungry men could consume. But she loved having people to cook for again. As they worked, the men shared more stories about their charity rides and the children they had helped over the years. They told Betty about kids who had received their first bicycles, families who got help paying medical bills, and hospitals that received equipment donations from their fundraising rides. "We started doing this about 8 years ago," Tom explained as he sorted toys by age group. "One of our members had a grandson who was fighting cancer. We wanted to do something to help kids like him. It just grew from there. Every year we try to do more," Frank added. "This year's toy drive was our biggest ever. When we started, we maybe collected 100 toys. Now look at all this." Betty looked around her porch, which was now stacked high with colorful wrapped presents. Her heart swelled with pride for these men who had become like family to her in just one night. Around 2 o'clock, they heard the rumble of a big truck coming up the road. Robert had arrived with his brother and their vehicles, ready to help transport the toys to their destination. The rescue mission was about to begin. Robert turned out to be exactly the kind of neighbor Betty had described. A sturdy man in his 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile. He jumped out of his truck and immediately started shaking hands with everyone. "Betty, you've got yourself quite a houseful," Robert said with a chuckle. "When Dave and Joe told me what happened, I knew we had to help. Nobody should be stuck out here, especially not with Christmas just around the corner." His brother Mike was younger and quieter, but just as eager to help. He had driven his pickup truck with the snowplow through some pretty rough terrain to get to Betty's house. "The main roads are getting plowed now," Mike explained, "but it's slow going. The good news is we can get these toys to the hospital before dark if we load up right away." The men worked together like a well-oiled machine, loading boxes of toys into both trucks. Betty watched from her doorway, amazed at how efficiently they worked despite not knowing each other well. Tom took charge of organizing the loading, making sure the toys were secure and wouldn't shift during the ride. "Betty, why don't you come with us?" Robert suggested. "The hospital folks would love to meet the woman who helped make this delivery possible." Betty looked down at her old house dress and laughed. "Oh, I couldn't. I'm not dressed for going anywhere important." "Nonsense," said Frank firmly. "You're the most important person in this whole story. Those kids need to know about the kind lady who helped their Christmas presents get delivered." The other men agreed enthusiastically. Before Betty knew it, she found herself bundled up in her warmest coat climbing into Robert's heated truck cab. She hadn't been on an adventure like this in years. The ride to the hospital was like traveling through a fairy tale. The snow had transformed the familiar countryside into something magical. Trees bent under the weight of fresh snow, creating natural arches over the road. The sun came out from behind the clouds, making everything sparkle like diamonds. "I've lived here my whole life," Betty said, looking out the window in wonder, "but I've never seen it look quite this beautiful." The convoy of trucks made its way slowly but steadily toward the hospital. In the truck behind them, the motorcycle riders were equally amazed by the winter scenery. Many of them lived in cities and rarely saw this much untouched snow. When they arrived at the children's hospital, word had already spread about the special delivery. Nurses, doctors, and hospital staff came outside to help unload the toys. Some of them had tears in their eyes as they saw box after box of presents being carried inside. Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital administrator, greeted the group personally. "We cannot thank you enough," she said to Tom and the other riders. "These toys will bring so much joy to our young patients and their families." But when she met Betty, Dr. Williams was especially moved. "Mrs. Betty, when Robert called and told us how you opened your home to these gentlemen during the storm, and how that made this delivery possible, well, we all knew we were witnessing something very special." Inside the hospital, the group got to see some of the children who would receive the toys. In the pediatric ward, young patients pressed their faces against windows, waving excitedly at the visitors. Some of the braver kids came out to meet their benefactors. A little girl named Lucy, who was about 8 years old and recovering from surgery, walked up to Betty with a big smile. "Are you the grandma who helped Santa's helpers?" she asked, Betty's eyes filled with tears. "I suppose I am, sweetie." "Thank you for making sure our presents got here," Lucy said, giving Betty the biggest hug she had received in months. Frank, the tough grandfather of 6, had to wipe his eyes when a young boy asked him about his motorcycle. "When I get better, can I ride with you guys?" the boy asked hopefully. You bet, kiddo, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. When you're all grown up and healthy, you can ride with us any time. The hospital staff showed the group around, explaining how the toys would be distributed. Some would go to children who were spending Christmas in the hospital. Others would go home with families who were struggling financially. All of them would bring smiles to young faces during a difficult time. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Williams made an announcement that surprised everyone. We've been so inspired by your story, she told the group, that we'd like to make this an annual tradition. Every year we want to partner with your motorcycle club for a Christmas toy drive. And Betty, we'd love for you to be our honorary coordinator. Betty looked shocked. Me? But I don't know anything about organizing toy drives. You know about kindness, Tom said. You know about opening your heart to help others. That's all anyone needs to know. The ride back to Betty's house was filled with a warm sense of accomplishment. The mission had been successful, but more than that. New friendships had been formed and a tradition had been born. When they arrived back at Betty's house, they found that Mike had used his plow to clear her entire driveway and the road leading to her house. Can't have you snowed in if you're going to be our new toy drive coordinator, he said with a grin. That evening, as the men prepared to continue their journey home, Betty felt a sadness she hadn't expected. These strangers had become so important to her in such a short time. Now don't you worry, Tom said, sensing her mood. This isn't goodbye. We'll be back to visit our favorite coordinator. Besides, someone needs to help you plan next year's toy drive. And, added Dave, we've got your address now. You're going to start getting Christmas cards from 15 new friends and all our families. Frank gave Betty a gentle hug. You saved us from that storm, but you did something even more important. You reminded us what Christmas is really about. Taking care of each other. Opening our homes and hearts to people who need help. The men had managed to get most of their motorcycles running. Robert and Mike had helped them dig out the bikes and get the engines started. A few of the older bikes needed some work, but they had arranged for those to be towed to a repair shop in town. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the motorcycles started up one by one. The sound that had seemed so frightening 2 nights ago now sounded like music to Betty's ears. Before they left, Tom handed Betty a piece of paper with all their phone numbers and addresses. Promise you'll call if you need anything, he said. And I mean anything. We're family now. Joe gave her a business card. If you ever have any emergencies, you call me first. The fire department isn't that far away, and I'll make sure someone gets to you quickly. One by one, the motorcycles pulled out of Betty's driveway and headed down the newly plowed road. Each rider waved goodbye as they passed her front porch. Betty stood there waving back until the last taillight disappeared around the bend. For the first time in 2 days, Betty's house was quiet again. But it didn't feel empty. It felt full of love, new memories, and the promise of continued friendships. She looked around at her living room, which still smelled faintly of leather and coffee, and smiled. Christmas was still a few days away, but Betty had already received the best gift she could imagine. She had been reminded that family isn't just about blood relations. Sometimes family is about people who show up when you need them most. And sometimes it's about opening your door to strangers who become friends. 3 days later, Betty woke up on Christmas morning to the most unexpected sound. The rumble of motorcycle engines filled the air, but this time it was different. Instead of the desperate noise of bikes struggling through a storm, this was the happy, powerful sound of many motorcycles running smoothly. Betty rushed to her window and couldn't believe what she saw. Not just 15 motorcycles, but what looked like 100 or more were lined up along her country road. Riders in leather jackets were getting off their bikes, and many of them were carrying bags and boxes. She quickly put on her robe and opened her front door. Tom was walking up her driveway with a huge smile on his face, followed by Frank, Joe, Dave, and all the others she had grown to love. But behind them came dozens of other riders she had never seen before. "Merry Christmas, Betty," Tom called out. "Hope you don't mind some company for Christmas breakfast." Betty stood there with her mouth open, speechless. "But why are there so many of you?" Frank laughed as he climbed the porch steps. "Word travels fast in the motorcycle community. When we told our friends about what you did for us, and how you helped us deliver those toys, well, everyone wanted to meet the famous Betty. Plus," added Joe with a grin, "nobody thought you should spend Christmas alone after everything you did for us." The riders kept coming up to the house, each one introducing themselves and thanking Betty for her kindness. There were men and women of all ages, some with their teenage children who also rode motorcycles. They had come from towns hundreds of miles away just to meet the woman who had become a legend in their community. "We brought Christmas dinner," announced a woman named Rita, who rode with a group from 2 states over. "When Tom told us you were worried about cooking for everyone, we decided to handle that part." The bikers began unloading coolers and bags filled with food. There was a complete Christmas feast. Roasted turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, and enough desserts to feed an army. They had coordinated the meal like a military operation, with different groups bringing different dishes. "This is too much," Betty protested, though her eyes were shining with joy. "I can't let you do all this for me." "Betty," said an older woman named Carol, "you have no idea how much your story has meant to all of us. Tom told everyone about your kindness, and it reminded us why we love this community so much. We take care of each other, and now you're part of our family." As the morning went on, Betty's small house became the center of the most wonderful Christmas celebration she had ever experienced. The living room was packed with people telling stories and laughing. The kitchen bustled with activity. As the riders heated up the feast they had brought, some of the younger riders played games with neighborhood children who had heard about the gathering and come to see what was happening. Others sat with Betty, showing her photos of their families and their motorcycles, sharing stories about rides they had taken and charities they had supported. "You know," said Tom as he sat beside Betty on her couch, "what you did that night changed more than just our Christmas. It changed how we think about kindness and community. Everyone here has been inspired to do more for others because of your example." Betty learned that the motorcycle groups had organized several new charity projects since their visit. One group was building wheelchair ramps for elderly residents. Another was organizing food drives for families in need. The women riders had started a program to deliver meals to people who were homebound during winter weather. "We realized we were so focused on our big annual toy drive that we were missing opportunities to help people year-round," explained Rita. "Your story made us think about how we could do more." Around noon, they heard more vehicles arriving. Robert and Mike had come with their families to join the celebration. Even Dr. Williams from the hospital had driven out with some of the nurses to thank Betty personally and share updates about how much joy the toys had brought to the children. "Lucy, that little girl you met at the hospital wanted me to give you this," Dr. Williams said, handing Betty a handmade card with a drawing of a house surrounded by motorcycles. Inside, Lucy had written in careful 8-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for helping Santa's helpers. You are the best grandma in the world." Betty wiped away tears as she read the card. "That sweet child. How is she doing?" "She's going home tomorrow, completely healed," Dr. Williams reported. "And she's been telling everyone who will listen about the motorcycle grandma who saved Christmas." As the afternoon went on, the celebration grew even larger. Word had spread through the small town about the gathering at Betty's house. Neighbors she had known for decades came by to meet the motorcycle riders and share in the festivities. The local newspaper editor arrived to document the story, though the riders politely asked him to focus on Betty rather than themselves. The feast was magnificent. Betty's small dining room table was expanded with card tables and picnic tables borrowed from neighbors. People ate sitting on couches on the floor on the front porch and anywhere they could find space. The food was delicious, but the company was even better. After dinner, something beautiful happened. The riders began sharing what they had learned from Betty's example. Many talked about how they planned to be more open to helping strangers. Others discussed new ways their clubs could give back to their communities. "Betty taught us that kindness doesn't require wealth or special skills," said Frank, standing up to address the group. "It just requires an open heart and the willingness to help when someone needs it." A younger rider named Kevin spoke up. "My grandmother always told me to treat strangers like they might be angels in disguise. Betty, you proved that sometimes the angels are the ones who open their doors to help others." As the day began to wind down, the riders organized one final surprise. They had pooled their money and bought Betty a gift that left her speechless. It was a beautiful wooden rocking chair with honorary grandmother of the motorcycle community engraved on a brass plate on the back. "This is for all the grandchildren Going to gain from our community, Tom explained. You're going to have birthday cards and graduation announcements coming from all over the country now. The writers also presented Betty with a leather jacket of her own, sized perfectly and decorated with patches from different motorcycle clubs across several states. On the back it said Betty the Storm Angel in beautiful embroidered letters. Now you're officially one of us, laughed Carol, helping Betty try on the jacket. Though you'll always be our most special member. As the sun began to set on Christmas Day, the motorcycles prepared to leave. But this goodbye was different from the one a few days earlier. This wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of a new chapter. Same time next year? Tom asked Betty as he prepared to leave. I'll start cooking now, Betty replied with a laugh. One by one, the motorcycles started up and began their journey home. But this time, Betty wasn't sad to see them go. She knew they would be back, and she knew that her quiet life had been forever changed in the most wonderful way. As the last motorcycle disappeared down the road, Betty sat in her new rocking chair on her front porch, wearing her leather jacket and holding Lucy's card. Her house was quiet again, but her heart was full. Sometimes the most unexpected storms bring the most beautiful gifts, and sometimes kindness creates a family that spans hundreds of miles and dozens of motorcycle clubs. Betty smiled as she rocked gently in her chair. Next Christmas was going to be even better.